Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Van Ostren, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, eBook Backfiles, Value, Use, and Relevance for Academic Libraries, sponsored by Springer and featuring Jennifer Kemp. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you will also see a Q&A panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We will spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please feel free to submit these throughout. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded, and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archived version. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Springer's Library Marketing Specialist for North America, Christy Showers.
Thanks, Jennifer, and again, welcome everyone. We're excited to be speaking with you today about eBook Backfiles, the Springer Book Archives, and the benefits they can offer libraries and researchers. As Springer's product manager of eBooks and a former librarian, Jennifer Kemp will be leading our conversation on SBA with her unique perspectives as both product expert and librarian. Prior to joining Springer, she was a publication manager at Highwire Press, and Jennifer's perspective on scholarly publishing has been shaped by her career at IBM Research, where she spent several years as the Acquisitions and Electronic Resources Management Librarian. Also with me today are my colleagues Roxana Acosta and Alan Roseman, licensing managers for the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. Roxana and Alan will be available during the Q&A session to assist in answering questions. At this point, we're ready to get started, so take it away, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm very glad everybody could join us today to hear about the value and relevance of eBook Backfiles. So the first thing I'm going to do today is provide an overview of the Springer Book Archives, which is what we call our eBook Backfiles product. Then I'll talk a bit about determining relevance for different kinds of users. And finally, before the Q&A at the end of the session, I'll go through some return on investment considerations. At this point, I think, yes, thank you. We've got a short poll to take. If you could tell us when you consider the start of archives for eBooks. Okay, great. I think that's almost everyone. Okay, so this project, which we wrapped up in January of this year, was our first attempt to get online as much as possible of our entire book catalog prior to 2005, which is when we first launched the very first STM eBooks product. So the cutoff date of 2005 is somewhat random. That's part of the reason we asked that poll question. These titles in the archive date back to 1842. They are online only on Springer Link, and now the work is as complete as possible. We don't expect to be adding to it substantially. And what we ended up with was 110,000 titles on Springer Link, a little over half of which are in English. Functionally and visually, Backfiles are really indistinguishable from our contemporary eBooks, if you're familiar with those. There are two minor differences. One, the SBA collections are not available by copyright year. So, for example, a library can't purchase Engineering 1970 or Medicine 1995 or something like that. Second, all SBA eBooks are available only from Springer. They're not currently on any aggregator hosting platforms. But otherwise, they share the same hallmarks of all SpringerLink eBooks. They're DRM-free, of course. They share the same liberal license terms and have the same functionality as all of our other eBooks, including the MyCopy print-on-demand service. Free MARC records are available from Springer as well as OCLC. So these eBooks are also, I should say, not at all kind of vintage in appearance. We took great care with the digitization of these titles. In some cases, cleaning up the print and scanning the images separately from the text and then merging them together. In some cases, multiple times. We really wanted to get the highest quality PDFs that we could. So the results of the scans are actually multiple formats, from the PDFs on SpringerLink to the huge amounts of metadata in XML. The vast majority of this metadata, of course, had to be newly created since so many titles predated ISBNs, or at least 13-digit ISBNs, and they all needed DOIs at both the title and chapter levels. In addition to MyCopy, digitizing all of these titles, many of which had gone out of print, means that they can, again, be sold in hard copy as well as going online. So it's a nice little irony that it's because they're eBooks that they're available in print again. The entire English archive is split into 11 subject collections, which mirror the profile and proportions of our contemporary collections, meaning that they extend back the subjects and the sort of volume of titles that we see in our more recent collections. The contemporary collections dating from 2005 forward, number 13, but the SBA predates our energy collection, and for this we combined professional and applied computing with computer science for a total of 11 subject collections. We didn't uncover any substantially new topics that aren't reflected in our current publishing programs. So one question that comes up a lot, since the name includes the word archive, which brings to mind, at least for some of us, that it's very old content, is really kind of how old is it? Most of it doesn't really date back to the days when doctors hawked cigarettes, though we do have a kind of smattering of titles from the first half of the 20th century. But most of the content actually dates more from the kind of big hair and neon clothing period. So it's about 85% of the content is actually quite recent. If you prefer, most of it dates from kind of the emergence of fax machines in the 1980s, if you remember those. I like to mention fax machines because I think it's a good example of the sort of arc of research and technology. The original patent for what we know of today as a fax machine actually dates to 1843, the year after Springer was founded. So, one could search SpringerLink and literally trace the whole history of this particular development, along, of course, with many others, computers, computer security, AIDS, the civil rights movement, antibiotics, and so on. Okay, so the question that comes up probably most often is whether Springer Book Archives is relevant for an institution's needs. So I want to talk just briefly about who SpringerLink users are, because it's maybe a little bit surprising who's using this content. First, non-PhD students make up the single largest category of users, followed by faculty. I'd be curious myself to know who make up the other category that you see at 6% there, but we don't have details on this one. I do think it's sort of a nice breakdown here, though, particularly at the kind of expert levels. So knowing that students make up such a high proportion of users, it's perhaps not so surprising that over half the users are in their 20s. What was surprising to me when I saw this is that a little under 10% of users are actually young undergraduate age, so under 20 years old. And the final demographic profile, again, a wide variety of user types here, but certainly a majority are students of various types. So, we sometimes hear that content is at perhaps too high of a level for many of an institution's users, but the users themselves seem to tell a different story, really, to a degree. And a related note is that a great majority of schools in the U.S. are considered sort of quote-unquote small colleges. And it's interesting maybe to note that the most popular Springer ebook collections at these institutions include, you can see here, mathematics, medicine, and the biomedical and life sciences, which is also a bit surprising since I think these are often thought of as research-level subjects in many ways. And actually, monographs are the book types used most at these schools, not reference works or contributed volumes or other titles that may seem more accessible to students since they're kind of divided up into more manageable parts. So of possible interest there. Now, in terms of identifying relevant content, this is true really of all Springer ebooks. It seems very helpful that just about all of the content has abstracts at the book and chapter level, in addition to front and back matter is free to all users. I also think it's useful to be aware that content, within a more advanced book, maybe the introduction or perhaps a few chapters, may be very relevant and useful to an end user, even if the title on the whole is perhaps a bit too advanced. So one final slide on this topic that is also a bit of a surprise perhaps is which archives collections see the highest usage and the highest number of denials. It was interesting to us that biomedical and life sciences is high up on both lists, since this is an area that typically has a fairly short half-life when it comes to journal usage. Math and chemistry are, of course, areas that are considered to age well, so to speak. But we weren't really quite sure how backfiles for biomedical and life sciences would be received. So this has been an interesting and pleasant surprise for us. Okay, so why did we set out to do this in the first place? We've heard from various constituencies over time, with some good reasons why we should put this older content online, and of course some of these reasons overlap. Springer obviously has a lot of content, and so preserving the scholarly record and clearing out some warehouse space seemed like a few good reasons. But, of course, we always want to hear from authors and librarians that we're moving in the right direction. And I think it'll be interesting to see, if and when other ebook Backfiles products come along from others. In the meantime, I selected here just one example, and this is one of a handful of those English titles that I mentioned date from the first half of the last century, in this case 1935. This is a chapter titled Artificial Illumination. And you can see here that there are print and electronic ISBNs and a DOI as well. And I use this example because I think it's perhaps one way that this very large collection may be relevant to users is with respect to our new-ish text and data mining policy. So artificial illumination is not really a very commonly used term these days, even though it's not especially technical. But a good use of a large corpus such as this is tracing the use of a terminology over time, something that doesn't necessarily require a kind of research level understanding of a subject. But it's maybe a whole is greater than the sum of its parts kind of situation. And we hope to get feedback on how this fairly new policy is working out for users. There's a lot of content on SpringerLink. I think we're now pushing 9 million documents of books and journals and protocols and others, all combined. So there's really quite a bit that can be mined or just simply searched together or separately as well. So next I want to share just two examples of bestsellers from the Springer Book Archives. These are bestsellers to end users. And I think the examples are interesting because, for one, there's a fairly wide span in the copyright dates. The one at the top is from the most recent year of the archives, 2004. And also because I think this helps illustrate the broad scope of the collections in the archives. So, for example, as a topic, acoustics could, possibly belong to engineering or physics. In this case, it's the latter, but, just looking at the title, it might be sort of hard to tell. The second example belongs to the biomedical and life sciences collection, and it's maybe a good reminder that life sciences content can be very different from biomedical. And I think it's also kind of interesting that both have a form of the term architecture in the title. We do a lot of analysis of this sort of thing, and I'm always sort of glad that there are some surprises because it seems to indicate that it's not always the most obvious, limited group of sort of usual suspects that stand out among so much content. I mentioned my copy earlier, and I just want to spend a minute on it here. This is our very low-cost print-on-demand service that allows end users to directly order softcover titles from almost any English language book in their library's collections, or at least ones that are under 1,200 pages. This requires no work on the part of the library, and it's exclusive to Springer Link. It's also very high quality. The covers are soft cover. They're in color. The inner work is in black and white. I always keep some examples in my office of some very thick books, and the bindings really hold up, and it's just sort of a nice, convenient service. Some titles are excluded for size, for example, if they have an unusual trim size or shape, basically. Or if they're very image intensive, like some astronomy titles, for example. They're not particularly well suited to print on demand. But most of our English catalog is available. So two sort of final numbers on this topic. The pricing, I think, is what I like to call kind of retro or throwback. It's just $24.99, and that includes shipping. And also with the addition of the Springer Book Archives, it means that we now have about 80,000 titles on Springer Link available as my copy, out of around 100,000 English language titles on Springer Link, both contemporary and archives. So a few slides on the topic of half-life I think I touched on earlier. It may be of interest to note that books are often cited much longer after their initial publications than journals are. And related to that is, how usage tails off over time for books is also a little bit different. So if you work backwards a bit from your right, usage of books in, say, 1992 is certainly much less than it is in 2012 on the far right of your screen. But it's also about in line with usage from 1978 and 1998. So we see a sort of sustained level of use over a good long while. The whole first 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of this, looking from left to right, shows roughly the same level of usage, even though it spans about 30 years. So to use one example of a real-life SBA customer, we see how dramatically their usage increased after acquiring the archives. This is shown in the orange bars that you see here. And then in looking at several customers of different types around the world, we see that book archives customers are getting an average of about 28% of all of their usage from the titles in the back file. So this is, again, it's prior to copyright year 2005. What I think is kind of interesting here is that the average usage is actually within a pretty narrow percentage range. The outliers for the 28% are pretty few. There's one at 79%, which in itself is interesting. A few just above 10%, but if you look, most are in the sort of 20 to 40% range. So that means 20 to 40% of all of their ebook usage is of this backfile content. Okay, so now that we've seen sort of what the Springer Book Archives is and taken a few approaches to determining possible relevance of it, I'd like to spend the final portion of the presentation on return on investment, or ROI. This is always a topic that's of interest for us, kind of on both sides here. The Springer Book Archive represents a really significant investment by Springer of time and resources, and it's very important to us and to our authors that the content is used, that it's cited, and so on. So we're always interested to hear how others are tracking ROI for themselves. So some of these slides are quite dense, and I'm not going to go through all of them in great detail. You can, of course, read along with me as I speak, and I will start with the caveat that many of these are estimates, and any individual institution's numbers will vary, but again, it's important to us to look at what the literature says on ROI, and again, to hear from customers what they're doing to determine it, perhaps beyond the more straightforward measures related to usage. So I think at this point we have a second poll question. If you could tell us if you participate in any of this type of activity. Okay, I think we're just about wrapped up there. Oh, we still got a few coming in. Sorry. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so this slide takes a look at some denial scenarios. So a denial is, simply when a user tries to access content and he or she can't get to the full text. So essentially, this is showing, what time might be lost when content isn't accessible and what some of the costs, direct and indirect, might be. And while these relate particularly to content, for example, how much extra time and or money does it take to source content that isn't readily accessible, maybe through pay-per-view or interlibrary loan, or walking away without getting what one is looking for. This also has some implications for library services overall. It may well be the case that a user is looking for a known item, or perhaps their need can be satisfied by another title in the collection. So I'll touch on marketing in terms of ROI in just a bit, but I think clearly the library always plays a significant role in an institution's productivity in many different ways. So not all these scenarios will apply all the time, but something to consider, some food for thought. Another factor we've been looking at is print, which doesn't always get a lot of attention in ebook discussions, so it's maybe a bit overlooked. But in fact, we do have conversations about it. We've even been asked about print business models, which is not a term we hear a lot. So now that there are really sizable ebook collections, both contemporary and backfiles, what are some of the considerations for holding on to print collections that may, in some cases, overlap with ebooks? This is a quite long paper, but it has a very interesting section on this. It's very relevant, we think, to the topic at hand. So, if you are interested, do seek it out. So I think what the authors are saying essentially is that there is a cost, whatever that may be for a given library, for keeping print books on the shelves, which of course sort of challenges the notion that print has a one-time acquisition cost. So the authors present a variety of scenarios for print holdings, which directly affect costs. And again, numbers will vary, but I think this lays out nicely some common considerations, some of the common storage types. And for all of the progress that has been made with eBooks in its relatively recent history, including their inclusion in digital preservation services like Portico and Clocks, it doesn't quite seem that we're at a point where libraries are realizing great space savings, at least from ebook acquisitions. So one final slide on this topic, which shows, the perhaps inevitable trade-off between cost and convenience. And I want to say I'm not, invested in whether libraries retain print or not. I happen to like print myself very much, but unless print is being kept because of some deficiency, perceived or actual, with the reliability or suitability of ebooks. So if libraries are holding on to print because ebooks are deemed to be inferior, then that's something that would be a serious concern to us. So in terms of ROI and usage, we have a projection of cost per use over time. And I think this is the sort of thing that is probably easier for publishers to do because we have so much data from which to draw on. But I'd certainly be interested to hear if any libraries are doing this. We frequently ask librarians when we meet with them, formally and informally, what it is that they're doing in terms of tracking ROI. That's why we asked the poll question, and we're well aware, and I know from experience that that it can be a lot of work, that not all libraries have the resources to do these sort of things. So it's something that I'm glad that we're able to do a bit here. So anyway, we project, of course, that usage is certainly going to decline over time, and that number will be variable. This is an estimate, but it's still somewhat sustained. I think we've seen that in a few of the other slides in terms of ebook usage, and so really quite a bit of usage can accumulate over time. So one example of cost per use over time, this is based on 20 early customers of the archives. I'd love to see a comparison of this alongside print, although I know at least with our ebook archives, it's just nearly impossible to put print values on so much content that spans so many years. But it might be a useful exercise, and we would be interested to hear if folks out there are doing anything in the way of usage projections. So I want to point out here a fairly short white paper we did recently on this topic. It's a little bit simpler than I think the analyses in some of the slides I just showed. If anyone's interested, it's of course free to everyone, along with several other white papers that we have on various topics. This particular one is more of a sort of literature review of the topic. And finally, so one more note, I think, before we open it up for Q&A. I think we're kind of all aware that marketing content and marketing services is an important and ongoing process that helps guard against low usage, and in doing so kind of boosts ROI, improves cost per use, and the like. So do you talk with your account development person at at Springer or your Springer rep. They're really very good resources for this sort of thing. They kind of do it all day long, and they're really a very nice group to work with. I think so with that, I will turn it back to my colleague Christy to start some Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen, for that great presentation. And it looks like we have some questions coming in already. So let's get started with a Q&A here for you guys. And the first one about the images. Are the images Oh, I'm sorry, the screen isn't opening the full question up for me. Okay, are the images or illustrations included in the titles, or are some excluded because of copyright issues?
So I know of no titles that don't have their full set of illustrations or images. So I think if a title is online, you should expect to see the full original set of images in it.
So basically everything that's in the original book was digitized, and you can expect to see it in its original form.
Right, and that's, I mean, it's true of text as well. There aren't kind of titles online that might have a chapter excluded. It's a sort of all or nothing proposition.
Okay, great. And I think that's a great lead into the next question, which is where did Springer get all of the books to digitize this huge collection?
Really from various sources. I mean, we were fortunate in that we did have a good deal of content in, warehouse spaces that were very pristine, that didn't need to be, cleaned up. But, in some cases they came from employee offices. In some cases they came from libraries. We always have to thank libraries when we talk about this project, because we used some, not only for content, but a lot of library catalog searching as well, because as I said, there's so much metadata that just wasn't around at the time of some of these titles. Some of them came from antiquarian booksellers. It's, I don't know, probably not the 80-20 rule, but you can get most of it up front fairly easily, and then you spend a good deal of time and effort digging down the last whatever percent.
Okay, great. So a variety of resources.
For sure, yeah.
And a question sort of about some of the slides that you discussed, and maybe Alan and Roxana can jump in here too. Basically, how are small colleges defined here, and talk a little bit maybe about the Carnegie class system.
Right.
But
I can talk a little bit about that.
All right, you can go, Roxana. If there's anything that you left out, I'll try to jump in.
Okay. This is Roxana. I'm the license manager for the Southeast. And I actually used to work with the small colleges last year. So basically, Springer uses the Carnegie classification system to tier institutions and classify them as quote-unquote small. So it would be any school that falls under an associate's level all the way through baccalaureate to small, master's small through large institutions. So that's what we classify a small college under those categories.
okay, great. Thank you. That's good. I hope that clarifies the question for everyone there. And then a couple more questions about the slides there. Sort of talking about the content. You talked about it being the majority was more modern. You showed the slide of the 1960s versus the 1980s. So a question here: what percentage are 19th century titles?
Well, for the English language collection, it's virtually zero. I think there are literally, 2 or 3 around the turn of the century. The titles that date back well before the first half of the 20th century, back into the 19th century, are really all German titles. So that's about a little less than half of the 110,000 titles are German. And there are some lovely books in the collection, so that have that beautiful old German script and some wonderful illustrations and things like that. But the English language titles really almost all date from the middle of the 20th century forward.
Okay, great. And so you've talked a lot in the presentation about the English language titles, and you just mentioned the German language a little bit. Are those the only two languages then, or is there some other languages we can see in the SBA collection?
It's pretty much English and German, but I should say that when we say English, it's a kind of shorthand. We really mean English/international, and by that we mean that there's always sort of a smattering of other languages thrown in there, a little bit of French, a little bit of Italian, a little bit of Spanish. Occasionally you'll find like a conference proceeding or something like that where you have some abstracts in other languages, but the body of the text is in English. But by and large, it's English and German.
Okay. And maybe another question for Alan and Roxana here is, can you purchase just the English language titles?
Yes. That's why we divided it up between English and German, so they're separate collections. So yes, you can just purchase the English language titles, of which there are around 56,000.
Okay, great. And a question here about the monographs. How did you come up with the percentage of the 3.2% decline of monographs?
I'm sorry, can you elaborate? In usage, I'm sorry. So yeah, I think it's not specific to monographs. It's usage overall. And we have a group here at Springer that does a lot of this kind of analysis. So they took a look at usage of, as I mentioned, some of these earlier SBA customers, and some usage trends overall that they see, for all kinds of content. So it's a bit of an estimate, but it's not sort of made up out of thin air, and it's not just monographs. It's looking at expected usage overall. And I should probably point out that when we talk about collections of any kind with Springer eBooks, it's certainly not just monographs. So anything we publish in a given copyright year, it doesn't matter if it's a reference work or a contributed volume, a monograph, et cetera, or series content, it's all thrown into the collection. We don't exclude anything by type.
Okay. And another question going back to talking about your usage slides, maybe for people that are less familiar, can you explain exactly what a denial is?
Yeah, sure. A denial is essentially when a user gets to something, they see something that they want, and they can't download the content. So there's a group called Counter that specifies how publishers are to count what is considered usage and what's considered a denial. So all the usage reports for any Springer content are what we call counter compliant, and a denial is a user trying to get to content that they can't, basically.
Okay, great. And it looks like we have just a couple more questions here. Where, if someone's looking for the complete collection, is there a list of all the books that they can find?
Yes. So you could look on Springer Link and you would see all the titles, but there's so many. Some of these are very large collections, so there's a certain export limit if you wanted to download it from Springer Link. So we maintain a page at springer.com/marc, M-A-R-C, and that's where users, anyone on the web, can get both title lists and MARC records. And the title lists are spreadsheets, and they include all of the same bibliographic data as is in the MARC records, just in a more human readable format. So you can look at title lists there of all sorts.
And they can separate lists out by the English titles and the German titles and...
Yep. Absolutely. And then you
Great.
can sort and filter when you get a list if you wanted to look at just, titles in the last 20 years or something like that.
Okay, great. And we have just one last question. Our we talked about My Copy in the presentation, and so you said that My Copy is for patrons. How do patrons get a My Copy book, and does the library have to own Springer content?
They do. So when a user is on Springer Link, because this is exclusive to Springer Link, they'll come across a book that they like, and they will see in the sort of lower right-hand corner of the screen an option to order My Copy. It's pretty clearly marked. It'll give the price right there. It's $24.99, and they click and order it just like they would any book on Amazon, really. There's nothing that goes through the library. There's no approval. They use their credit card, and the book is delivered usually within a week to their office or dorm or home, whatever they choose.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for those fantastic questions. If you're looking for more information on SBA or My Copy, some of the other things we talked about, I invite everyone to visit springer.com/librarians. There's a wealth of info there. And it looks like we're ready to wrap up, so I'd like to turn things back over to Jennifer.
Great. Thanks, Christy. I just want to give our presenters a virtual round of applause for spending time with us today. And just as a reminder to all the participants, we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from us that will include instructions